Okay, here's the thing. You've probably done historical criticism before without knowing what it's really called. Historical criticism is the belief that in order to understand a piece of literature, we also have to understand the author's biography, background, and political beliefs of the time. Think of it as the context of a piece. In order to better understand what's on the page, you have to examine the writer who created it. Makes sense, right? This type of criticism was slightly tweaked when New Historicism came into play, which is a slightly different type of criticism. Instead of just looking at the facts, like time period or setting, New Historicism takes into account the cultural and social beliefs and background of the author and the time period in which they lived. It also begins to examine how the author interpreted their ideas, perhaps where they went to school or what the general cultural beliefs were of the time. New historicists don't believe that we can look at history objectively, but rather that we interpret events as products of our time and culture, and that we don't have clear access to any but the most basic facts of history. Our understanding of what such facts means is strictly a matter of interpretation, not fact. Basically, New Historicism holds that we're hopelessly subjective interpreters of what we observe. Wait, what? It's pretty simple. When we looked at the version of the American dream written in the Declaration of Independence, that whole life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, we realized it was really different from the dreams that you all spoke of. Why? Well, for one reason, we live in 2015 and not 1776. The things that we value are different. The society in which we live is constructed differently. If a student in an English class in 2056 was looking at your dreams, they're absolutely going to interpret the American dream differently than you did. They probably think what you want is outdated. Bottom line, circumstances matter. For our purposes, think of New Historicism as having two major pieces. One, to study how the context of a piece adds to your understanding of it. How does it reflect the society and the cultural context of when it was written? And two, how does it make a comment on that? Writers all have a purpose, and many times it's to critique the society in which they live. This is actually pretty cool because it shows us how much of a role society and culture plays in what's created at the time, whether that be literature, movies, or music. Think about what you're surrounded by every day. If someone in 1920 listened to Anaconda by Nicki Minaj, they'd definitely be confused. Our knowledge and interpretation of what Miss Minaj is discussing is very different than what the actual definition of an anaconda is.
So let's start there, the 1930s. What's the biggest thing going on right about then? It's the Great Depression. The stock market crashed in 1929 after an era of unprecedented prosperity. This era was known as the Roaring Twenties. Think Gatsby's excessive spending, new money, and extravagant parties. However, throughout this decade, the banks were unregulated, spending was unmonitored, and the reckless behaviors of those involved in the economy led to an absolute meltdown. Hoover was president, and he was really unpopular. He advised the people to have patience and self-reliance to make it through this time. What a jerk. Over 15 million Americans were unemployed, and many waited in bread lines, begged, and sold whatever they had to support their families. But Hoover didn't believe it was the federal government's job to help. In 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected to the presidency. He referred to Hoover's leadership as a hear nothing, see nothing, and do nothing campaign. He basically said they ignored the people and did absolutely nothing to help them out of the Depression. And he was kind of right. In 1935, FDR announced the Second New Deal, a plan to create even more jobs and help trigger the economy. When campaigning for re-election in 1936, he stated, "The forces of selfishness and lust for power have met their match and their master." Alright, so this makes sense. He was against all the stuff the 20s stood for. And that's kind of what the 30s was, realizing how dumb all of it was because it wasn't really fair and, quite honestly, backfired. The poem you've read was written in 1935, so Langston Hughes was right in the middle of this. If Fitzgerald was so clearly influenced by the 20s when writing Gatsby, we have to assume that the 30s had an impact on Hughes too. So let's talk about Hughes. Alright, so let's talk about Hughes. Most people know him as a Harlem Renaissance writer. The Harlem Renaissance was a boom of art, culture, and music coming out of Harlem, celebrating African American heritage, culture, and pride. Hughes wrote a lot of poetry during this period. It was also in the 1920s. He spent 1921 at Columbia, but eventually dropped out. After wandering around for a little, he ended up in Europe in the 1930s after traveling around the U.S. as a lecturer. Throughout this time period, Hughes wrote what's considered revolutionary poetry. He was annoyed with how the government seemed to ignore what the people needed and America's inability to fix either racial oppression or economic degradation and exploitation in society. What this means is that the poor stayed excessively poor and there was almost no social or economic movement, especially for those of a lower class or a different race. And the government let it happen. He dabbled in socialism and the communist left, but what's important from that is that he was interested in undermining capitalism. Hughes was tired of this incredible inequality wherein the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. He wanted those who worked for it to get compensated appropriately, and thought that objects should be valued by use and not capital. Hughes preached for common ownership and the sharing of profits. He wanted the ones building products in factories to reap the benefits too, not just the factory owners. This was a popular idea circulating during the time period because so many Americans were desperate to get out of the Depression. Okay,